Hey guys, welcome to my bathtub. Just ignore that. I don't really want to talk about it. You know what I do want to talk about though? Ancient China. Well, more specifically, I want to tell you about the death of King Xuan of Zhou. King Xuan was king of China during the Zhou dynasty around 800 BC. One day he was riding into the town of Jiangshan, but he stopped when he heard some children reciting an ominous chant. Up goes the moon, down goes the sun. Bows of mulberry wood, quivers of reed. Soon the Zhou shall perish. The king took some of these children aside and asked them where they had heard such a song. The kids said that a mysterious boy dressed in red robes had passed through the town a few days ago, taught them this verse, and then left, never to be seen again. Now, the king was disturbed by this story, but he was even more disturbed after he told it to his grand scribe, who said that this boy in red was actually the human form of the planet Mars, and that his song was a prophecy foreseeing the king's demise. You have to understand that Jiangshan was famous for his mulberry bows, so the king, fearing potential rebel uprising, ordered that all bows and arrows in the town were to be gathered up and destroyed. He assigned this monumental task to his minister Zhou, who went and organized a mass collection and disposal. Overall, the project went well, but after the ban, a merchant had been spotted selling bows in the town square, which meant that there were still bows and possibly arrows in the town. The king took this as a sign of failure for Zhou, and like many ministers before him, the king ordered his execution. But before Zhou was killed, he said he would come back to haunt the king, and he did. A few days later, the king was out on a hunt in the woods, and in the distance appeared the ghost of Zhou, carrying a bow and just one arrow. He shot the king, killing him instantly with a mulberry bow. So, why am I telling you this story? Well, this is the very first case of a haunting in human history. That's right, there are none before it. But what is a haunting, right? If we want to just talk about ghosts, we can go all the way back to Mesopotamia, where ghosts were more or less a part of daily life. While the idea of a ghost might be frightening now, in Mesopotamia, they were seen more as pests than anything scary. The first account of a ghost in human history we can point to was inscribed 3,500 years ago on this tablet. It depicts the ghost of a lonely old man with directions on how to put his soul to rest. The reader is instructed to fashion an idol that be transformed into a lover for the old man in the next life, persuading the ghost to move on. But not only is this not really a haunting, it's not even a ghost story. It's the ancient equivalent of a blog post about getting rid of ants from your house. In Mesopotamia, if you died under some gruesome circumstances, or if you had some unfinished business, your soul might be inclined to stick around this plane of existence. If it was suspected that you might come back as a ghost after dying, it's likely your loved ones will put an inscription on your grave to keep you from crawling out of it. One such inscription discovered by the British Museum reads as follows: "If ever a long time from now, far into future time, in the days to come, anyone should find this tomb, may he not clear it away, may he restore it. May that man who finds this not despise it. Rather, he should say as follows: this tomb I shall certainly restore it. May the favor he did be requited him. Above, may his omens be propitious. Below, may his ghost drink pure water." While all of this is interesting, I don't think any of it really falls under the banner of hauntings. In my mind, a haunting is a malevolent infestation by a ghost or spirit. People can be haunted, objects can be haunted, and the most common trope of them all, the haunted house. And the very first haunted house story in history comes from the Roman Empire. This is the haunted house of Athens. In about 200 BC, a philosopher named Onyros was visiting the Greek city of Athens with the intention of buying a house. He came across an advertisement for a beautiful house with a suspiciously low price. Upon further inquiry, the philosopher learned that strange things had been occurring in the house at night. Occupants would hear the sound of chains being dragged along the marble floor, seemingly towards wherever they were in the house, but upon investigating the sound, it would suddenly stop. Sometimes too, the ghost of a malnourished old man would be glimpsed from the corner of your eye, but just for a moment. The house changed hands fairly regularly, as no one could sleep soundly within it, and even though nothing out of the ordinary happened during the day, fear was enough to keep any occupant anxious and constantly on their toes. Being a Stoic philosopher, Athenodorus was interested in the boundaries in the natural world and exploring whatever logic guided such extremes, so he decided to buy the house with the intention of living there while continuing his writings. Throughout that day, his servants moved his furniture into the house, and when night fell, he dismissed them so he could spend the night alone. After a couple hours writing by candlelight, he started to hear the anticipated scraping of chains in the distance, growing ever closer. He decided to ignore the sound and continue writing, but the sounds kept growing closer and closer until they were basically at his door. The scraping suddenly stopped, but it was replaced by violent thumps on the door. This was too much for the philosopher to ignore, so reluctantly he got up and answered the door. The sight that greeted him was a disheveled specter of an old man with a long beard draped in rags. The shade didn't say anything, but it turned around and beckoned Athenodorus to follow, so he did, and they ended up in the courtyard outside the house. The ghost stopped for a moment and then vanished abruptly. The philosopher marked the spot where the spirit had vanished and decided to investigate what lay beneath the soil the next day. A few hours later, the morning rose, ending a sleepless night, and the philosopher ordered his servants to dig where he had marked the ground. Just a couple feet under, they stumbled upon a skeleton in chains. Athenodorus reported this to the city, who unshackled the skeleton, gave it the proper ceremonial rites, and then buried it in a pauper's grave. Once this had been done, all paranormal activity at the house ceased, and the philosopher enjoyed his peaceful house that he had bought for a bargain. I find the story really fascinating because of the classic ghost story tropes it seemingly pioneered. The ghost dragging chains along the floor is something we would later see in Charles Dickens' 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol, where the miser Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by the spirit of his deceased business partner, Jacob Marley, who warns Scrooge that he's headed down the same path he was only 7 years ago when he died alone, and Scrooge's fate might be even worse if he doesn't change his greedy ways. Marley's guilt is depicted in the book by a heavy set of chains that he's cursed to wear for eternity. Another famous trope from the haunted house of Athens is a ghost trying to get the living to solve its mystery. In the 1999 movie A Stir of Echoes, Kevin Bacon's character is haunted incessantly by the ghost of a teenage girl who keeps telling him to dig, and that's what he does, but nothing seems to come of it. Eventually, though, he uncovers a set of bones in a brick wall in his basement, and he's able to solve her mystery, finally putting her at peace. Sometimes, though, even solving a spirit's mystery isn't enough. In the 2002 movie The Ring, a haunted videotape found in a room at an inn causes the viewer to die 7 days after watching it. After a lengthy investigation, Naomi Watts' character Rachel, along with her boyfriend, are able to trace the source of the videotape to a girl named Samara, who is feared in her village because of her strange abilities. She had gone missing some years prior. They return to the inn to find out that the well in the video is actually below the room where the videotape was found. Rachel falls into this well and experiences a vision explaining the story behind Samara's murder. Once at the bottom, she finds Samara's body and they both leave the well. After giving Samara a proper burial, everyone thought that the mystery was solved, but unfortunately Samara still pays a visit to Rachel's boyfriend. It turns out that solving her mystery did nothing, and the only reason Rachel had been spared was because she had showed the video to her boyfriend. The only way to save yourself is to introduce someone else to the video. You know, The Ring is an American version of a Japanese movie called Ringu, and that Japanese movie is based on a book of the same name. But did you know that the book was inspired by a 300-year-old Japanese folktale? This is the story of Okiku. In 1655, a servant girl named Okiku had a problem. She worked for a samurai named Oyama Tessen, and he was madly in love with her, but she didn't feel the same way. The samurai eventually came up with a devious plot to make her his lover once and for all. He hid one of his family's 10 precious delft plates, and then called Okiku into his room. The samurai lied and accused Okiku of stealing the 10th plate, which is a serious crime that would normally result in a servant's execution. But the samurai gave her a proposition. He would forget the crime if she finally became his lover. Okiku became frantic. She knew she hadn't taken the delft plate, and she didn't want to trade her body for her life. She refused the samurai's offer, trying to convince him that she had done nothing wrong. The samurai became enraged and sentenced her to death. Okiku was still trying to convince everyone of her innocence when she was thrown into a well on the property, where she was finally silenced, but only temporarily. You see, in Japanese mythology, if someone dies in a fit of rage, they might come back as an Onryo. This is what happened to Okiku. After her death, anyone who passed by her watery grave would see a dismembered head rise up from the well, whispering numbers. The counting would start at 1 and go up to 9, where there would be a short pause, and then the head would start to let out a horrible shriek, and this shriek wouldn't end until someone would shout 10 at the head, at which point it would stop, at least until the next person walked by. Onryos are a fairly popular motif in Japanese ghost lore. Sadako in The Ring, or Samara in the American version, is a good example of a modern-day Onryo. And then there's the ghosts in the 2002 Japanese movie Xuan, The Grudge. While The Ring was about a haunted videotape that victims have to show to other people to save themselves, The Grudge is about a haunted house that seemingly infects people, and they unknowingly pass on the haunting to other victims, even if those people haven't been to the haunted house themselves. The main gist of the movie is that a man finds out that his wife is having an affair, so he murders her and their son. The mother and the son come back as Onryos, and they go on a rampage, haunting and killing many people over the years. There is not really much more to it than that. The movie tends to jump from haunting to haunting fairly quickly without leaving much room for any character to develop themselves or their story with much depth, but that doesn't matter too much because whatever this movie lacks in depth is more than made up for with its horror. I remember when I was a kid, the other kids at school would talk about how The Grudge is the scariest movie ever made. And after seeing it for the first time as an adult 15 years later, I actually think it lives up to the hype. The horror is incredibly well done, and it's all really simple as well. There aren't many special effects. The mom and the son look dead, decayed, and just overall creepy, and they more or less just show up in places they shouldn't be. But when simple ideas like that are done well, they can be really effective. I mean, this movie has so many iconic scenes. The blanket scene is the one that sticks out the most in my mind. The movie also uses lighting changes really well to convey not only mood shifts, but also to show the audience when a character is being possessed by one of the ghosts. It's obvious that Grudge didn't have a huge budget to work with, but I don't think they really needed one. I can totally see why this movie has become the cult hit that it is. The idea of a person dying in a fit of rage, only to come back and terrorize the living as a ghost, and seemingly killing everyone and everything they come into contact with, isn't an idea unique to The Grudge or The Ring. If we turn the clock back 700 years and travel to Iceland, we'll find a supposedly true story that shares quite a few similarities with these Japanese movies. This is the story of Thorolf Half-Foot. A man named Thorolf had leased some of his land to another man named Snorri. A patch of woods happened to be on this land, and Snorri began cutting down some of the trees that were there to harvest wood. Thorolf wasn't happy about this, and he confronted Snorri, saying that cutting down trees on the property broke the terms of the lease. Unfortunately, though, they only had a verbal agreement, and Snorri said he wouldn't stop cutting down the trees on Thorolf's land. This made Thorolf pretty upset, so he rode off to see his son Arnkell. Thorolf and his son Arnkell had a bit of a rocky relationship, and when he visited him, he told him he wanted to set things right. Arnkell was really happy to hear this from his father, but then his father said that he needed his support in this dispute he had with Snorri. Arnkell felt that his father only wanted to reconnect because he needed some help with something, which led to a huge fight that ended up with Thorolf storming out and going home. When Thorolf got home, he sat in a chair by the table and stared at the wall. He sat in the same position all night, and by the time the sun came up, he was dead. One of Thorolf's servants sent for Arnkell to come help bury his father. When Arnkell got to the house, his father was still sitting up and staring at the wall. All the servants had been too scared to even go into the room. Arnkell told everyone it was essential they don't pass through the corpse's line of sight, lest they be cursed by its gaze. Arnkell snuck up behind Thorolf and closed his eyes, then moved him to the floor. The corpse was much heavier than it should have been, and it took all of Arnkell's strength just to push it over onto the floor. The corpse was so heavy, in fact, the only way they could get it out of the house was to make a hole in the wall and have a team of oxen drag Thorolf's body out of it. The oxen dragged the corpse just out of the village to a suitable burial place, and a tomb was built around the corpse. Arnkell then dealt with all the standard things people back then needed to deal with when a loved one died, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. Not right away, at least.
After Thorolf was laid to rest, life in the village would start to deteriorate. The oxen that had pulled his body all died under mysterious circumstances, and villagers had started going missing as well. It got to the point where no one would even dare step outside after sundown, as they would hear strange noises at all hours of the night. At one point, they found the body of a shepherd who had gone missing from the village, and his corpse was black as coal. Every bone in his body was broken. Animals started dying as well. Dead birds that started piling up on Thorolf's tomb because they would die as soon as they touched it. People started moving away, and the village started to resemble a ghost town. After the winter had passed, our uncle decided to return to his father's tomb along with a couple servants to move his body further away from the village to ease this reign of terror. Again, a team of oxen were needed to drag the body and its unnaturally heavy weight. They got a few kilometers outside the village and were on top of a hill when all the oxen suddenly dropped dead. Our uncle and his servants couldn't move the body any further on their own, so they decided to use this hill as Thorolf's permanent final resting place. They built a new tomb around him and also erected a tall tower around the tomb, both to keep people out and also to keep Thorolf in. After Thorolf was moved to his new tomb, all hauntings in the village ceased.
I think this might be my favorite historical ghost story. It has some strikingly modern horror elements, like the body being so heavy only oxen can move it, and not being able to cross a corpse's line of sight.
Now, Thorolf Half-Foot was written around the year 1300. If we move over to the Middle East, this is when the Islamic Golden Age was happening. Many technological advancements in literature were being developed in this time. 1001 Arabian Nights is probably the most famous book written during this period, and honestly, it deserves a whole video on its own. It's got some really crazy stories, and the word ghoul actually comes from this book. There's just one story I want to talk about from 1001 Nights, but before we talk about it, we have to talk a little bit about Jinns. You see, up to this point, every haunting we've talked about has been caused by the ghost of someone who has died, but not every haunting happens because of a ghost. In Western culture, the alternative to ghosts are demons. Jinns in Islamic culture lie somewhere between ghosts and demons. They're not people, but they're a lot like people. They have societal structures, they eat, they reproduce, but they also have supernatural powers and operate on a different plane of existence. They tend to haunt abandoned or lonely places, and even have been known to possess people.
While we typically associate demons with malevolent intent in Western culture, jinns are somewhat neutral. They've been known to both kill people and also bestow great wealth upon them, almost like a genie in a lamp, which makes a lot of sense because the word genie stems from the word jinn. The story from 1001 Nights I want to tell you is about a jinn haunting. This is the haunted house of Baghdad.
Around 700 years ago, in a town outside of Baghdad, a man named Ali was about to inherit a great fortune from his father, who had just passed away. Ali had been raised strict, and he had a wife and kids to take care of, but after his father died, he fell in with a bad crowd of rich party boys and began to adopt their lifestyle. At one point, he stopped working completely to focus on partying, and just a few years later, he had spent almost all of his father's vast fortune on this extravagant lifestyle. This put Ali in a bit of a bind, but with the encouragement of his wife, he used what little money he had left to become a traveling merchant, and he set off to Baghdad to sell his wares. When Ali got to Baghdad, he inquired with the local merchants guild about a place to stay. A member from the guild informed him that there are 2 houses available. One is quite small and old, but there's a second much larger and luxurious one. Ali, just fresh off a couple of years of living lavishly, decided to go with the larger one, but he got a stark warning from the guild. This house was haunted by a nasty jinn, and no one in recent memory has survived even a single night there. This didn't bother Ali for some reason. Ali gets to the house and orders his servants to get it ready for him. Much like a certain philosopher in Athens 1300 years prior, he orders his servants to leave so he can spend the night alone in the haunted mansion. Once he's alone, he starts reciting the Quran when he hears an ominous voice say, "Ali, son of Hassan, shall we send down the gold?" To which Ali responds, "Send away." Gold coins then start raining down on top of him, and a jinn appears in the room. Confused, Ali asks the Jinn why they just dropped a bunch of gold on his head. The Jinn responds saying that every time someone stays in the house, he would say the same thing, "Ali, son of Hassan, shall we send down the gold?" And when most people hear this, they just react with confusion because their names aren't Ali. So, of course, the Jinn killed all those people. But Ali actually answered the Jinn because his name is in fact Ali, so this gold is probably his. The Jinn also tells Ali that there's more gold for him waiting in Yemen, and if Ali frees him from this house, he would tell him where this gold is. Ali says that's not good enough. The Jinn would have to go fetch that gold from Yemen himself and bring it back to Baghdad, and then he would unbind him from this house. The Jinn agrees, but Ali isn't done yet. The Jinn would not only have to fetch the gold, but also Ali's family, and they would have to arrive in Baghdad in a magnificent caravan. The Jinn agrees to this as well and sets off. The next day, the member of the Merchants Guild is shocked to see that Ali had survived the night in the haunted house and gives him more gold for getting rid of the Jinn. About a week later, the Jinn comes back with the gold from Yemen and Ali's family in a magnificent caravan, of course. Ali decides to move into the house permanently with his family and opens up a shop selling exotic goods. Ali makes a ton of money, yada yada yada, his son becomes the king. And everyone lives happily ever after.
I don't really get this story. Usually in a tale like this, you'd expect some ironic twist at the end, punishing the main character for being greedy and selfish. But it's just a series of events that only benefit Ali more and more every time. I even left out all the political stuff that results in Ali's son becoming the king because it's disconnected from the rest of the story and it's not really interesting. It almost feels like something your drunk uncle might say around the campfire and he's just kind of making it up as it goes along. And that might not even be a totally inaccurate assessment. A lot of the stories in the 1001 Arabian Nights were passed down through oral tradition. So, to the uncle that came up with the Haunted House of Baghdad, thanks, I guess.
The Haunted House of Baghdad isn't the only story where a haunting turns out to benefit someone eventually. If we move back to modern times, the 1947 movie The Ghost of Mrs. Muir starts off much like the Haunted House of Athens or the Haunted House of Baghdad. A widow and her daughter move to a quiet village on the English coast, and when given a list of houses to rent, she decides to go with the one that has a reputation for being haunted. She checks out the property with her realtor, and they're driven out of the house by a ghost only a few minutes after they stepped in. Despite this, Mrs. Muir decides to still rent the house. Shortly after moving in, the ghost makes contact, and it turns out he's a gruff but charming fisherman named Captain Gregg. Captain Gregg tells Mrs. Muir that he usually drives people out of his house, but he was impressed with her for braving the haunting, so he's gonna let her stay, as long as they share a bedroom. And then he watches her undress and comments on her figure later.
Yeah. Never let anyone tell you to be ashamed of your figure.
Look, I know this movie was made in a different time, but he just kind of insults Mrs. Muir a lot.
Oh, I suppose being a woman, you can't help it.
Can't help what?
Making a fool of yourself.
I get that he's supposed to be a gruff sailor who's ultimately caring and well-meaning, but honestly, you can do better, Queen. From here on out, the movie acts mostly as a romance drama. Mrs. Muir starts to have money issues, so Captain Gregg comes up with a plan where he'll dictate his life story to her, and she'll write it up into a book. They bond over this process and a romance sparks, although they can't even touch each other. On her way to the publisher's office, she meets a suave and persistent man, and again, I get it's a different time, but she only starts to act charmed by him when he basically tells her he's never gonna leave her alone whether she likes it or not.
But I shall not go away even if you send me, and I shall see you again even if you forbid it.
I'm sure I have no control over where you go or what you do.
Captain Gregg is jealous of this, but he also wants Mrs. Muir to be happy, so he brainwashes her while she's sleeping. Unfortunately, it turns out that her suave IRL suitor actually had a wife and kids all along, so she just kind of spends the rest of her life alone, until she ultimately dies where she's finally reunited with Captain Gregg.
In the end, Captain Gregg ended up having good intentions, but it doesn't usually end so well for other victims who are won over by ghosts. In The Shining, Jack Torrance decides that the Overlook and the ghosts that reside within it are more important than his family, so he tries to kill them. In the book The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, a young woman is part of an experiment being run to see the effect of a haunting on different people. She lives in the house for many months and experiences many supernatural occurrences that no one else seems to notice. Slowly, she becomes withdrawn from everyone around her and starts spending all of her time in the house. The conductor of the experiment becomes concerned for her well-being and decides to take her away from the house against her will. As he drives her away, she grabs the steering wheel suddenly, yanks it to the side, and crashes the car into a tree, killing them both instantly.
It seems like ghosts can cause people to do horrible things they otherwise might never do. But then again, us humans are capable of some pretty awful things all on our own. In 1977, in a small town on Long Island, New York, a man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed all 6 members of his family while they were sleeping. His motives to this day are only speculated, but some think he was driven to do it by ghosts that live in the house. Ronald was arrested and his family's home was sold at a very low price to the Lutz family. You can see where I'm going with this, right? The Lutz family started to experience paranormal activity shortly after moving in. They contacted the media and started calling in paranormal researchers to visit the property, including Ed and Lorraine Warren, whose likenesses and stories would later be used in the Conjuring series of movies. The hauntings of the DeFeo murder house quickly became a national sensation, and the Lutz family was quick to capitalize off of it, releasing a book and movie called The Amityville Horror. You've probably heard of the Amityville Horror because it was a huge success and has spawned a major franchise. There's a lot of weird things surrounding the Amityville Horror. For one thing, the haunting itself is a little strange. The Lutzes claim that there would be unexplained odors. Rooms would randomly be filled with flies, green slime would sometimes ooze out of the walls, and Kathy Lutz was once temporarily transformed into an old woman. I'm not kidding, it actually says that. If the haunting wasn't strange enough, what's stranger is that William Weber, the lawyer that defended the killer Ronald DeFeo, claims that he and George Lutz made up the hauntings together so they could sell the story and provide a better defense for Ronald. There is actually a bit of truth to this. Lutz and Weber had plans to sell the haunting story to a publisher, but Lutz ended up cutting Weber out of the deal. Weber came up with his own story about the haunting anyways, so Lutz sued Weber, Weber sued Lutz. It became a whole ugly thing. The validity of the hauntings has been questioned a lot over the years. George Lutz himself later said that some of the details just weren't true, like the green slime for example, and the priest who visited the house actually testified that he didn't encounter anything paranormal there, and the story about him being run out of the house just wasn't true. Kathy Lutz's son Christopher later claimed that almost everything described in the book was made up, and that while there was still a minor haunting, it came from George Lutz's active interest in the occult. It's also worth noting that the Amityville Horror House has changed hands over the years, and none of the occupants who lived there after the Lutz family have reported any paranormal activity, although it gets many unwanted visitors by fans of the movies and books.
The Amityville Horror has one foot in the world of fictional hauntings and one foot in the world of real-life hauntings. If we're going to talk about real-life hauntings, we have to talk about paranormal investigations. I already mentioned Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are arguably the most famous paranormal investigators, Ed being a demonologist and Lorraine being a medium and clairvoyant. Paranormal investigators use an array of equipment and procedures to trigger and record paranormal activity. I'm going to go more in depth on that in a little bit, but first I want to talk about another haunting that Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated.
In 1986, the Snedeker family moved into the lower unit of a duplex in Southington, Connecticut. The building was originally used as a funeral home, and soon after moving in, the Snedekers started to experience paranormal activity in the form of ghost sightings and even violent personality changes in one of their sons. They called in Ed and Lorraine Warren, who allegedly found strong evidence of a haunting, and they started a media campaign. A book was written, documentaries were made, and the story was adapted into the 2009 movie A Haunting in Connecticut. While the movie was a major success, soon after its release, a lot of evidence started to come out that would call into question the validity of the haunting. Sound familiar? For one thing, the author of the book, Ray Garden, said that Ed Warren had told him to make up a story based on facts that the Warrens themselves had made up, like that the morticians who worked at the funeral home were practicing necromancy. It also came out that the Snedeker's son had schizophrenia, which might explain personality changes. And probably the most damning of all, the upstairs neighbor in the same building experienced no paranormal activity at all during the time that the Snedekers were allegedly being haunted.
Much like the Amityville Horror, The Haunting in Connecticut was a financial success, grossing over $77 million at the box office, despite its dubious factual basis. It seems like people just like a good ghost story, whether or not it's actually true. And good ghost stories make for good business. Just look at all the supposedly haunted houses and hotels you can visit. I don't think there's anything quite as American as turning tragedies into business. Last summer I visited Salem, Massachusetts on the way back from a vacation in Maine with my fiancé. Salem is a really beautiful old city in New England, but it has a dark past. It's of course famous for the Salem witch trials where 300 years ago, many innocent people were accused of practicing black magic and were wrongly executed. While I was expecting to see mostly solemn memorials to this sad piece of history, I instead found a whole witch economy, with many horror stores, witch stores, and haunted house experiences. It all felt kind of strange considering the people who were executed in Salem weren't actually witches. Now, there were definitely more serious nods to Salem's dark past, but they were outweighed by a whole city center devoted to horror stuff. And don't get me wrong, I love horror stuff, that's why I'm making this video. But in Salem, it felt out of place. Now, if we're going to talk about real-life hauntings, paranormal investigations, and the money they make, we've got to talk a bit about the TV show Ghost Hunters.
If you haven't heard of Ghost Hunters, it's a reality show on the Discovery Channel about paranormal investigations that's been on the air since 2004. The formula is fairly simple. The team will meet up at some haunted property and give some background and history about the location and whatever paranormal activity has been occurring there. Then, at night, they'll go into the building and start their investigation. The investigation in almost every case is pretty anticlimactic. They'll hear some spooky sounds, but not much else usually happens. The next day, they'll meet up with the owner of the property and show him the evidence they've collected, which unfortunately never really amounts to much. When watching the team on Ghost Hunters perform an investigation, it's always obvious that they're not going to find much, and I feel like they purposely use techniques to fabricate paranormal activity. For example, they'll split up into groups and each group will have a sound guy listening to an audio feed from a handheld audio recorder. If you're not familiar with these audio recorders, you can plug in headphones, turn the gain way up, and you'll hear every little sound in your house, no matter how quiet it is. And with two teams walking around different parts of the same house, I feel like they end up recording each other's footsteps and voices most of the time.
I mean, I could be wrong, but that sounded like a whimper.
So you heard that?
Of course.
What's even more deceiving is that they'll only ever play little snippets of audio. A lot of them are so short that the listener can't reasonably tell what's being played back to them, and the team always reacts as if they made some amazing discovery, and that influences the viewer's perception.
And?
Where did that come from?
And of course, the editing and sound design of the show are both very sensationalized like every other reality TV show.
Let's do an experiment. I've got a little handheld audio recorder and we're going to do our own little paranormal investigation right here in my bathroom. So I'm just going to record a little bit. Okay, let's play back like a random 2-second piece of audio from that recording. Oh, I think that's a ghost. So now let's listen to an unedited stream of audio. Fuck! Okay, maybe that was a bad idea in this particular circumstance, but you know what I mean, right? Right?
Ghost Hunters might just be fluff, but I remember a genuinely creepy moment from a different reality show involving a haunted house from when I was a kid. If you're not Canadian, you might not be familiar with the show Kenny vs. Spenny. It was a pretty popular show back in the 2000s. Basically, it's about two best friends who do competitions against each other, and the loser has to humiliate themselves in some way. Competitions could get pretty ridiculous. Some examples are who can drink the most beer, who can stay awake the longest, and even who could smoke the most weed. The show worked really well because of the chemistry between Kenny and Spenny. Spenny was a straight man who tried to do everything by the book, and Kenny would always trick Spenny and find some way to win by cheating. There are some really crazy moments on this show. Like there was one competition where both of them had to keep a dead octopus on their heads, and the first to take the octopus off would lose. Kenny slipped Spenny an actual tab of LSD, and I mean this episode is just amazing.
Show everybody the beautiful bugs. Life, that's where life begins. Oh my god. Oh! Oh my god! covered in shit. You're covered in shit. That's disgusting. You pooed. Wash it off.
The whole series is available on YouTube. I highly recommend watching it. But what does this have to do with hauntings, you might ask? Of course, Kenny did his best to fake paranormal activity to try to scare Spenny away. But Spenny was determined, and he eventually handcuffed himself to a radiator and threw away the key. Kenny then started to do a satanic ritual when this happened.
Speaking of complete darkness, the power went out, but no problem, I've got candles. It's kind of like I'm having a nice relaxing bath. You know, I think it's a perfect time to play some Game Boy.
I've talked about a few different forms of media in this video so far, but I had a really hard time figuring out which video games I wanted to talk about. When it comes to video games that center around hauntings, there's really a lot of choice. But in the end, I wanted to talk about Lavender Town in Pokemon Red and Blue the most. That might seem strange, but I think Lavender Town is a really effective haunting story, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who was creeped out by this part of the game as a kid. When playing through Pokemon, you get used to the idea that Pokemon faint when they're defeated and can get revived at the Pokemon Center, which makes them as good as new. But Lavender Town introduces the idea that Pokemon can die. You learn that Team Rocket has not only been using Pokemon for criminal activities, but they've been killing them as well. You enter Pokemon Tower and meet former trainers mourning the loss of their beloved Pokemon, and you end up having to battle the ghost of a Marowak that died trying to escape from Team Rocket and is searching for his lost orphan Cubone. It almost feels like a bad dream. Lavender Town introduces real-world adult ideas to what's otherwise a children's game, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who has vivid memories of not just the area, but its creepy music as well. It's been the subject of some internet urban legends, the most prominent being Lavender Town Syndrome. In 2010, a pastebin page started to circulate on the paranormal board on 4chan. It alleges that after Pokemon came out in Japan, child deaths greatly spiked, and these deaths were specifically linked to the Lavender Town theme. The story says that something in the music was causing children to go completely mad, sawing off their limbs, jumping off of buildings, and ultimately finding different brutal ways to take their own lives. The developers had to actually change the theme when releasing the game in the West. I'm not going to spoil the whole story here because I actually think it's pretty good. I recommend reading it yourself.
Lavender Town Syndrome is an example of a creepypasta, and I guess I should probably talk a little bit about creepypastas. I probably don't have to explain what they are, but just in case you don't know, they're short horror stories shared on the internet. Creepypastas in a lot of ways bring ghost stories into the modern age. Almost every historical ghost story I talked about earlier was written anonymously. They survive through time by word of mouth as folk stories. Creepypastas are also often written anonymously, and instead of being passed around by word of mouth, they're passed around message boards and forums. Creepypastas also focus on the modern times we live in. Ben Drown, for example, is about a haunted copy of Majora's Mask, and Smile Dog is about a haunted JPEG file.
Creepypastas don't just use the internet as a platform, they also sometimes use it as a medium for making stories more immersive. Possibly the first creepypasta, Ted the Caver, was told in real time on a blog in 2001 from the perspective of its main character. It details the experience of a spelunker exploring a mysterious and possibly haunted cave. Each post would describe what's happened since the last post was made. The reader might not even know what they're reading is a work of fiction. ARGs, or alternate reality games, have taken this idea of telling fictional but seemingly true ghost stories to the extreme by using interconnected web pages, YouTube channels, and social media accounts to tell stories from the perspectives of multiple characters. They even sometimes utilize audience participation to uncover pieces of the story and move it forward. But ARGs are a really huge topic, so that's a whole other video.
You know, I've been thinking, everything we've talked about so far has just been stories, right? Even with the real-life hauntings, there's never been any proof that a haunting's actually happening. Sure, there are people on Ghost Hunters who will tell you they've seen a ghost from the corner of their eye, or they've heard a ghost calling their name in the distance. But who's to say the stories they've heard about these haunted places hasn't influenced what they're expecting to see or hear? Or maybe they're in a lonely, dark, and scary place and their mind is playing tricks on them. And then their experiences turn into stories that influence other people's perception. I spent so much time researching ghosts in the last little while, maybe it just got to my head. Thanks for watching. Have you ever felt defeated? Well, the protagonist of 1408 certainly did.
While The Shining is a Stephen King story about a haunted hotel, 1408 is a Stephen King story about a haunted hotel room. We're introduced to a writer named Mike, played by John Cusack, who writes books debunking haunted places, and he's also apparently a surfer. One day he's going through his mail, which seems to be mostly ads for haunted houses, but a postcard telling him not to stay in room 1408 at the Dolphin Hotel in New York catches his eye. Intrigued, he calls a hotel to book the room, but it's apparently unavailable for the whole next year. He does some research and finds out that room 1408 has seen many deaths over the years, and the hotel just keeps it empty now. He tasks his publisher with getting him the room, and conveniently they find a legal loophole that forces the hotel to give Mike the room. Mike gets to the room, and the manager tells him that 56 people have died in the room, all within an hour of entering it. He tries bribing Mike with room upgrades, expensive whiskey, and even baseball tickets, all to keep him out of room 1408. But Mike thinks this is just part of some haunted experience he's paying for and takes the room anyways. Mike gets to the room and it seems normal at first, but he starts to notice little things happening, like a painting becoming crooked for no reason or chocolates mysteriously appearing on the bed. Things start to get slowly worse until the clock next to his bed starts a countdown from 60 minutes, implying that Mike will die within the hour like all the other guests. A bunch of 2000s generic horror plays out for a while, and eventually a blast of water comes through a painting in the room, and he washes up on the beach. You remember when I said Mike was a surfer? Well, it would seem that he fell and hit his head, and this was all just one big horrible dream. His ex-wife comes to visit him in the hospital, and afterwards they reconnect over dinner. Mike still remembers everything from the room, and he spends the next while writing his experience into a new book. When he's done, he brings it to the post office to mail it to his publisher, but before he can, some men in the post office start demolishing the walls, and Mike never really left the hotel room. It was all one big hallucination. And this is the first time we see the room in its true form. A door appears behind Mike, and behind it lies an infinite void. There's no escape. A few more spooky, scary things happen until the timer on the clock hits 0, and the room completely resets, and the timer starts again. Mike isn't only trapped in the room, he's also trapped in an endless 1-hour cycle. The room, however, presents him with a way out. And, oh, the lights came back on.
Is it over? Maybe some things really can't be explained. But then again, I think some things can. In almost all of these stories, even stretching back to Mesopotamia, there's a common theme of a haunting starting because of someone dying through some horrible injustice or because they left some business unresolved before passing. And so they come back as a ghost to either fix these problems themselves or to scare the living into doing it for them. Ghost stories in haunted places are scary. They're meant to frighten us. But the idea that death is truly just the flick of the switch might be even more frightening. Maybe the idea that we can come back as a ghost and solve our problems even after death is, in an odd way, comforting. Thanks for watching. And by the way, if you're curious what happens at the end of 1408, Mike doesn't use a rope. He sets the hotel room on fire, and the firemen come rescue him, and he lives happily ever after. I also want to thank my beautiful and talented fiancée Carolina for providing really great art for this episode. I really think it made the video like way better than it would have been without it. Okay, that's it. Thanks.